Good morning. And it's good to see everybody here this morning. I want to invite you to turn your Bibles to Luke chapter 5, verses 27 through 39. Our reading was just from Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 through 39. And this morning, as you first look at those two passages, you may think that they clash a little. But I think as we go through the lesson, you'll see that there is a little bit of connection that this lesson from Luke brings to the lesson in Matthew. But this month we're going to be talking about eating out with Jesus. All of us from time to time, I suspect, go out to a restaurant and eat. And we may even go with our friends. Or occasionally we may have the opportunity to eat at a banquet or even one-on-one with someone that we really respect or that we're somewhat in awe of. I know a couple of years ago I had the opportunity to sit down one-on-one at lunch with Chuck Yeager, the first test pilot to crash through the sound barrier. That was an amazing moment. I found out some things about his faith that amazed me, that we're not going to go into here right now. But it was an opportunity to eat out with someone. And when we eat out, I'm sure no one's ever had the experience that things happen that you didn't expect to happen at the dinner. The food wasn't quite what someone expected, or someone who you highly respected blurted out something that just shocked you. So, I want you to ponder these things as we consider eating out with Jesus. Because sometimes when we're reading the letters of Paul, I think especially, we say, wouldn't it be wonderful just to sit down with Paul and ask him what he meant by that? And indeed with Jesus sometimes, too. Jesus, could you go into a little more detail? What about this situation? We'd like to know these things. And so we're going to look at some situations in which Jesus ate out with people. And what happened at those dinners over the next few weeks. In today's lesson, we'll be talking about when Jesus ate with the wrong people and how other people thought about that. How some people just never are satisfied the next Sunday. Then, you ever been to a party and everything's a wonderful party and then someone does something that just ruins the whole party? How to ruin a celebration. And then you plan a party, you get your guest list ready, you send out the list, and nobody shows up. And finally, the last Sunday in our series, we'll talk about why we dine with Jesus and when we dine with Jesus. But today we are talking from Luke chapter 5, verses 27 through 39, about eating with the wrong people. Perhaps at some time in your life you've heard someone said, I saw someone with so-and-so and I just can't believe that they would hang out with that person. Or they would be seen with such an individual. And that's the kind of scenario we find in Luke chapter 5, verses 27 through 39. But before that even happens, Jesus encounters a man. His name is Levi. Levi was a tax collector. We read of other tax collectors, and Zacchaeus probably leads to mind. Zacchaeus was a different kind of tax collector than Levi. Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector. Levi was the kind of tax collector who worked for people like Zacchaeus. But Jesus encounters Levi in Matthew 5, chapter 5, verse 27. After this, he went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And leaving everything, he rose and followed him. As we look at this verse and the verses that follow it, we're going to ask some questions. Sort of putting ourselves in Levi's shoes, but also thinking about us if we had been there. How would you prepare to eat with Jesus? Who would you invite? If you invited Jesus over to your house to eat, who else would you invite? Who would you not invite? And what was there on this particular occasion that bothered other conscientious, good, God-fearing people about Jesus and his dining habits? And finally, we'll ponder this question. Why did Jesus eat with the wrong people? First of all, how do you prepare to eat with Jesus? Here we have a picture that you may or may not be able to see well. And there's a man walking down a crowded cobblestone street. And he's in front of a booth. And at that booth is a man that's leaning forward to listen to him. The man that's walking down the street is Jesus. Levi is the man leaning forward to listen. And Jesus is saying, "Follow me." And if you look at the picture closely, you see that there are Roman soldiers in the background who are guarding Levi's tax collection booth. Because Levi, as a tax collector, wasn't like an IRS agent, and we all loved him dearly. He was like an IRS agent for the Chinese government working in America to collect taxes from us. And just think about how we'd feel about that. We wouldn't like that at all. We would hate that. We would need armed guards, like Levi had, to protect us while we were working. But Jesus walks up to him and says, "Follow me." And despite the, I'm sure, understood discouragement for him to do so by the presence of those Roman soldiers, Levi did exactly that. He laid down his stylus and left his booth and followed Jesus. It says, leaving everything, he rose and followed him. We'll find later some indications that leaving everything didn't mean that Levi sold his house instantly and gave up all his friends that he had known the tax collection business. But he did immediately leave his place of work, left it behind him to follow Jesus wholeheartedly. It was a life-changing decision. And that's what following Jesus is. In the New Testament and today, when we decide to follow Jesus, we're making a decision that if we pursue it carefully and seriously, will change our lives and the direction of our lives. Levi decided that part of following Jesus for him meant that he needed to let all his friends know about this person that he was giving up everything for to follow. Because I'm sure they're wondering what has gotten into Levi. Levi decides to have a party, a banquet, if you will, and to invite his tax collector friends and other friends to it. So he prepares his invitation list. Now, who would you invite, and who did Levi invite? Well, Levi invited the other tax collectors. And he invites some people that are called here in our text when later they're criticized sinners. When it's first mentioned, it says there was a large company of tax collectors and others reclining at table with them. Now, one thing to consider here is that these tax collectors and these others were all, like Jesus, Jewish people living under the Mosaic covenant. The tax collectors were collaborating with the foreign government. And these other people, we get the understanding, were living in a way, doing things, saying things, making decisions that seriously clashed with the law of Moses. They were not faithful followers of the Lord. These are the people that Levi invites to eat with Jesus. He may have invited some Pharisees. We're not really told, but we do know they knew about it because they're the first ones to criticize the other people who were invited. Who do you invite to eat with Jesus? Tax collectors, people living in ways that clash with the law of the Lord? What would that look like today? What would that look like today? I think the passage from Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 through 39 might give us some hints. You might invite some people who swear. You might invite some divorced people. You might invite people who treat other people badly, who are rude. As you go down through the list in Matthew chapter 5, people who do the kinds of things that are discussed in chapter 5, or just with Matthew 5, are the kind of people that Levi invited and that we might want to consider inviting to eat with Jesus. And the other thing is, were these tax collectors, you think, poor? Not really. They actually collected more than they were supposed to collect, so they developed a fairly healthy income. So while there may have been some poor people at this luncheon, as there definitely were some others we'll consider, there were rich people at this luncheon too. But they were rich people who were outcast from polite society. And they were the people that Levi invited. When Jesus is criticized, when the Pharisees grumble to his disciples saying, "Why do you eat with and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" Jesus answers. He doesn't make his disciples carry the responsibility for the answer. "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." Jesus acknowledges, notice, that there are people eating with him who are living lives that are in conflict with God's will. And he doesn't say that's okay. He's calling them to repentance. But he's here for that reason. He's here to help these people heal. And that's the remarkable thing that we miss in our English Bibles. The word for heal and the word for save in Greek are the same verb. Sozo. So when Jesus heals someone, he is saving them physically. When he saves them, he is healing them spiritually. The church isn't a museum for good people. Come to see the display of all the great people. It's a hospital for broken people who are healing, and for people who have healed to an extent, who are now helping the others heal. Now, do you criticize how Jesus ate? Well, the Pharisees and the scribes certainly did, because as they saw it, there were some dietary laws and traditions that Jesus broke from time to time along with his disciples. There were people they did not associate with because of those people's habits. And these people certainly were at that dinner. So they're criticizing how Jesus ate. Why do you dine with these people? Now, among their traditions were that religious leaders like the priest and people who were zealous about following the Lord, like the Pharisees, and people who were itinerant teachers of prophets, like John the Baptist, often engaged not in going to feast, but in fasting, and in fasting in a group. Now Jesus is now eating out with tax collectors and sinners. So the Pharisees come to him, they say to him, the disciples of John fast often and offer prayers, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees, but yours eat and drink. Why aren't you fasting? Did Jesus ever fast? Certainly he did. After he was baptized, he went up into the wilderness, and for 40 days and nights he fasted. But that is not the reputation that follows Jesus throughout his ministry. He's criticized for eating too much and too often, for not fasting enough. It's not wrong to fast, Jesus says. But right here, Jesus' point was, this wasn't the time to fast. The Pharisees and the scribes point out, we're fasting. Who else was fasting? The disciples of John the Baptist. And we often think of John the Baptist and Jesus as being like that. But here's an instance where John's disciples may have been saying, what's with this Jesus guy? I thought John liked Jesus, and look what Jesus and his disciples are doing. They're not fasting. Because the disciples of Jesus were not. They were with Jesus at Levi's feast. What they're missing is that for Jesus, recovery is the issue. Recovery is the goal, not quarantine. That's not original with me. I got that from a writer named Darrell Bach. And that brings us to the question, why did Jesus eat with the wrong people? We've already alluded to it. He was about healing and saving. He came to those who needed a physician, those who had serious distress in their spiritual and their physical lives, and brought them hope. He affirmed God's power to reverse things, to change things, to transform our lives, to make situations that seem hopeless suddenly seem happy and wonderful, because there has been a transformation, if not of the circumstance, certainly of our attitude toward it, and our ability about persevering through it. Jesus gives hope where there had been none previously. And part of that transformation is a phrase that gets bandied about sometimes a little unfairly. As Jesus talks about his disciples not fasting, he has two illustrations. One is, can wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? No, that's time for a feast. Time for celebration. It's not time for fasting. I know the Greens had a wedding a few weeks ago. One of their daughters. And after that wedding, you had a fast for all the of the guests, right? Not at all. Mary is thinking, that was a great idea. Why didn't I think of that? I don't think your daughter would have liked that. Okay. All right. No, we don't fast after weddings. They didn't fast after weddings in Jesus' time either. Then he says, no one tears a piece from a new garment and puts it on an old garment. If he does, he will tear the new, and the piece from the new will not match the old. Anybody ever done that? Try to put some new cloth on an old, where there's an old pair of jeans, and have it not want to stay on there right? I will confess, I occasionally try to mend my own clothes, and have done so over the years, and I tried that once, and it just did not work. Finally, no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the new wine will burst the skins, and it will be spilled, and the skins will be destroyed. But new wine must be put into fresh wineskins. And no one, after drinking old wine, desires new, for he says the old is good. There are some things here we don't quite know what to do with. Because how many of us carry around leather flasks for our Coca-Colas and our iced tea and our other beverages that we drink? We just don't do that. If you can see, there's a light brown rock wall here with what looks like an animal skin hanging from it, and that's sort of what it was. That's how they made the wineskins. From animal skins, and then after they cured them and prepared them right, made them safe to drink from, they poured the grape juice or the water into them. Now when they poured the grape juice into them without preservatives, of course it began to ferment. And if you filled it full, as it began to ferment, it would expand. If it was a new wineskin and nice and supple, it would expand. The new wineskin would expand with the new wine. If it was an old wineskin that's been used and cleaned and dried, it would be more brittle. And so as it began to ferment and expand, the wineskin would burst and the liquid would just go everywhere. Jesus' teaching, as we go back to Matthew 5 again, you have heard it said, but I say. Jesus brings about changes in the way things have been done. He brings about new attitudes, new actions, new ways of approaching life. It's colored with love, but sometimes that love means that we're disciplined. Jesus' new ways clashed with the understandings of the scribes and the Pharisees. So they said, no new wine, please. We're old bottles. Not literally, but that was the attitude. We're not ready for this. Sometimes we talk about what would Jesus do? And I'm afraid sometimes when we ask what would Jesus do, we really want to know what John the Baptist would have done. And we'll talk about that more in the next couple of weeks. Eating with the wrong people. In Luke chapter 5, verses 27 through 39, Jesus eats with the people that his contemporaries think are the wrong people. People with whom he should not have associated because of their collaboration with a pagan government, foreign government, and because of their lifestyles, things that they had done and were doing. Jesus points out that he's not there to affirm what they're doing wrong. He's there to help them heal, to help them find God's way in their lives. And that's why he's there for us today. He's not there to help us make sure we do everything right in a rule book, but He's to help us transform our lives into God's image. So that when people see us, they see Jesus walking around with us, and His attitude, His Spirit in us. So my questions as we conclude this morning are, as you are thinking about having Jesus eat out with you in your life, are you preparing a great feast for Jesus? Are you getting ready to give Jesus your best and invite your friends to share the feast? Do you invite your friends to meet Jesus? And are there times when Jesus has a teaching that clashes with a tradition in our culture that you really are a little bit embarrassed by Jesus? That's a question I don't think we ask ourselves often, but maybe we should. Are there times when Jesus embarrasses us? And we just simply will not know we're a Christian. Think about it when you're at work, when you're at school, and someone asks you something or wants you to do something. Pretend Jesus is right there by your side because He is. And say, am I glad He's here? And finally, if today your life is hurting, you are hurting, your life is broken, Jesus is looking at you just like He did to Levi. And He's saying, follow me. Come believing and believing. Repenting of what you've been doing wrong. Putting it behind you. Confessing that Jesus is the Lord. And having died to that sin, being buried in water in baptism, and arising from that water into a new life. So, this morning, as we stand and sing, will you dine with Jesus? Please come while we stand.